Hello again. As promised, it is now time to start working on the last third of the subfloor. Most of the prep work has all been done. You can see around the edges there's little, I don't know what they'd be called, braces, I guess, to allow the subfloor boards to have something to actually connect to. And as with the previous section, it's pretty straightforward. Start in one corner with a triangle and work your way across. And there's our little inspector trying to get my attention. The more floor there is, the more willing she is to come out, which is odd because I always thought cats liked to climb stuff, but apparently this one doesn't so much. I did learn the hard way that crawling around on these floor joists can be very painful on the knees. I ended up actually getting some blisters from it. And we tried to... Emily was kind enough to go to the hardware store and get me a pair of knee pads. And they kind of worked, but not really. And I don't know if it was that I had them on wrong. They actually caused a rash and chafing behind the knee where the straps were. And if I tried to loosen them, then they would just flop around and wouldn't go anywhere, wouldn't stay where they needed to stay. And so I'm not entirely sold on their actual value. We'll try them, I guess, when I'm not starting with blisters already, when we do the subfloor removal and replacement. So I figured before I get too far, I should go ahead and get the supports for the... I don't know what they're called. Stabilizing blocks. In a wall, they're called fire blocks. Maybe they're still called fire blocks in the floor. Anyway, they just run down the middle of the floor to help stabilize everything, lock everything in place, keep remove some of the flex from the floor joists themselves. I just came to a realization. In the last video I mentioned that I was going to take all of the cottonwood boards out and spray them again with borax, but that would require removing all of these joist block supports. So that might not happen. They may just get sprayed where they are, and I don't know, maybe I'll have to find a nice warm day and crawl under there in the shade and spray them again from underneath, or maybe just don't worry about it, who knows. That is the one downside to actually using the cottonwood under there. It was cheap, it was free, it was easy to use. It doesn't splinter, which is actually really nice to work with. If the blade's not sharp, it does tend to get hairy, I guess would be the right way to describe it. It gets like fuzzy offshoots, but because it's actually not a very rot resistant wood, if we ever do plan to take this out on the road, in addition to putting new axles under it to support all of the added weight, we would have to spray the underneath with some kind of underlayment type of a sealant. But we'll see. Basically, if this ever gets moved, it'll pretty much just be moved around the property from one spot to another. So I'm not too worried about that, but that's just something I'll have to keep in mind if I ever do decide to move. If we decide to ever take it somewhere else. And here I'm just throwing a couple of galvanized screws into each floor joist. I'd already done this initially, but I learned the hard way that the pressure treated wood, I knew it would eventually cause corrosion on the regular iron. I did not think or realize that corrosion would take place. Yeah, see, there's the knee pads in question. Anyway, I didn't think it would take place within less than 6 months. And maybe that's because it's the Pacific Northwest and it's, super wet and rainy out here. But I swear I've never seen it rot out, corrode that metal that quickly. It's kind of crazy. So I actually ended up picking up some 4-inch screws and some 3 1/8 inch some decking screws, and then some long 3 1/8 galvanized nails for the nail gun. So I'm actually going to have to go all the way around the perimeter and just make sure that all of those rim joists are secured a little bit better. There's I was trying to figure out, there's a wrench I found, a little Allen wrench that I found on one of the boards, just sitting there, and it took me a while to figure out where it actually came from on the saw. Somehow it slipped out sideways. And it's a little tiny hole that doesn't really look like it actually belongs there. It kind of sticks out. I don't know how, I've never paid enough attention to actually notice it there, but oh well. Anyway, as with the flooring, I mean, like I said, this part is really quite quick. I did run into a slight issue because in the first section I had specifically milled some 12.5 foot long boards so I could actually run all the way from corner to corner. In the second section I didn't have to worry about that because we ended up adding that little 21-inch riser, so I only had about 6.5 feet to go from the riser to where I ended up having the boards end. But in this section it's still a full 8x8 section, so I needed to have 12-foot boards. So a few of them I ended up splitting once they got long enough to do so. And that's what I'm doing right here, is figuring that out. And coincidentally, I'd love to say this was intentional and that I actually planned it this way, but that particular floor joist that they ended up needing to land on, the one that I'm kneeling on right there, was not actually milled for this purpose, and it's closer to 2.5 inches wide. It just happened to be a 6-inch board that I was milling, and I milled it down to whatever its actual thickness is. To be honest, I've never even measured it. But I knew I needed an extra board, and instead of waiting and having everything on hold and then continuing to have to put a tarp over everything and dealing with all of that longer, I ended up just using that extra board from something else. So coincidentally, that worked out to be a perfect spot to run an 8-foot board and be able to create that parallelogram for the floor joists. So that was rather convenient. And then here I'm already in the corner, so I've got that marked out, and then I can start going back to trapezoid measurements. And then some of these shorter pieces resulted in long enough offcuts that they actually worked to get some of these smaller pieces. And working around the posts for the door was definitely one of the bigger challenges. But it presented the convenience factor that what I could do is just leave them hanging and get them all in place and then go back, and you'll see at the end I ended up just cutting several in a row right there while they were already in use. I don't think flooring would be this, like there was a few different steps that I had to take on this because it's a trailer and a post and beam. And admittedly some of it is because I am not an expert at building. I learn and I do what I can, and I study and read and watch videos. And I mean, the challenge with all of that is that you're limited on the information available to the person presenting it. So for instance, if you're watching these, I don't advertise these as how-to videos because technically that would introduce a liability if I'm saying here's how you do this. Instead, what I'm saying is here's how I do this, or how I did this. And if you want to learn from that, that's your choice. That's great. So be it. That's up to you. But if I were, more of an expert, maybe if I had a license in construction, then I could actually say, look, hey, here's how you do this. Since I don't, I won't. It is what it is. And I have the little bit of the luxury of being able to say if it takes a few extra steps, so be it. It's a learning curve. Everything I do while building this is experience behind my belt and knowledge that I've learned and gained firsthand, and I will always remember. And so when I get around to building, the barn, the shed, some of the bigger structures, those will be smoother processes than if I had just started with them immediately and not done any of this stuff. It's the same thing with the concrete for the sheds that we have poured on concrete slabs. There are several concrete pads that I have poured, and each one, well, I almost said each one gets better, but since the last two I screwed up on the cement blend, they looked definitely better than previous ones. Until I tried to drive the tractor over them, and they were only rated for probably somewhere in the 700 pounds per square inch range after I reevaluated my concrete recipe. So yeah, that's something that hopefully this summer I will be able to get back to some of those projects. Because this spare room will be functional and usable, and my daughter's wedding will be out of the way and done, and I won't be prepping for that. But then again, who knows? Maybe all the DJ stuff that I'm doing, we're planning on having that be another part-time hobby income business. maybe that'll catch on and I'll spend more weekends doing that than I anticipate. I don't know. There are a lot of people around here who like their parties. And I could always travel, up into Seattle or Portland if I wanted to, but not really keen on that. I like to go up there when it's to do something fun, to hang out with friends. But for the most part, I try and stay away from big cities. I'm definitely not a city person. I was basically born in the forests of Massachusetts and out in a little town, little community, and I've kind of always just stuck with that. Every time I move, it's always to a smaller and smaller place, and you can't get too much smaller than where we're at now. It's a population of about 700, so it's a pretty good size for me. So sorry about that. I didn't catch the battery dying quickly enough, so I got a little bit of progress that wasn't caught. Emily ended up building the fire and getting some of the scrap wood going to help warm me up. It's actually really surprising how well that burn barrel actually radiates heat. Once you get it warm, I can be in the backside of this camper, and as long as there's not a wind, I can actually feel the heat radiating from a good fire in there. But this particular fire is not so much for warmth as to just get rid of small scrap pieces of wood. So here we go with that awkward corner piece again. And I mentioned in another video that it might be easier to just do this in two pieces, but it does tend to give it a little bit more strength to leave it as a whole piece, and I'd have to do a little bit more bracing around the post, I think, if I were to do two individual pieces. So we'll see. I also mentioned that some of the boards are slightly different thicknesses, so you can see the shadow from the two boards that I'm actually kneeling on, and they're just a little over an 1/8 inch thicker than the two boards behind them, like closer to the camera. So I'll have to work on that and figure those out. But then here's where I was talking about where I can just pick up each individual board after marking it exactly where it needs to go, and I think if I do this again, I think I should put the roof up, put most of the girts on, and then do the subfloor before I do the siding, because then I could have literally just thrown the boards down and only have to cut them when there's a joint. There's also definitely something to be said about if these had been finished, planed boards. They don't necessarily have to be like perfectly smooth boards, but at least all the same thickness and width, because then I could just start laying them down, and whatever joist they happen to land closest to, I can just cut that angle, screw it in place, cut the angle on the next board, throw it down, and just keep working my way across. And then wherever they're on the outside of the boards, wherever they hang over the rim joists, then all I'd have to do is come back with the circular saw, or a track saw would be even easier, and just zip all the way down and cut all the angles all at the same time. And then once that's done, then I could put that bottom girt on, although that might not even have been necessary, because I could have just screwed no, I think I would want that, because that girt does hang out past the rim joists, so that would create a air gap between the siding boards and the floorboards. So now we've got that all done, and we ended up using some river rock that we were given to cover all the mud in the areas outside around there where we end up having to walk. That way we don't track mud into our camper or into here. And since we had a couple extra wheelbarrows full, we ended up piling I think 3 wheelbarrow fulls in front of the door, just so that it would raise that up. And there's only like a 8-inch step, I think, to get from the gravel up into the trailer. And I needed to take a few minutes because the fire was dying down and starting to smoke a little bit. So I took the leaf blower out there to stoke it. Make sure I got a good fire going. Then I can get back to I'm working on the door jamb, and actually by the time the evening finished out, I actually had the door in place, and I didn't quite get it built supported enough, so I ended up having to come back through and add a cross brace, excuse me, which I knew I would have to do, but we did actually square the door up, and I wish that I had realized the batteries were dead, and I don't know why I didn't. It was a long day working on this. That's the advantage of Saturdays, is I have all day to work, so there's definitely more time available. And the one battery, so the first camera dies, I swap that out for the second camera, and then while that's going, the first battery can charge, but it takes longer to charge than it does to record and drain the battery. So someday I might see if I can find a couple replacement batteries for them, but these are just little GoPro Hero 3 Plus silvers. They're going on, I think, 15 years old or something like that. They're pretty old, but I mean, they still work, and that's what counts. No point buying something new and replacing them if they still do the job. The only actual complaint I have about them is just that low light issue. You can see that it's in here where the camera is actually standing on the tripod. It's super dark and super contrasted brightness outside. But that's okay. That's something I can work with, I can deal with. So I'm putting the last of the girts up for this particular wall. That way I can start working on siding. And that last girt that I put up, I don't know if you noticed, it was not perfectly straight. It was actually a piece of scrap 2x3. And since it's actually being attached directly into the post over the door, the beam over the door, I figured I wouldn't worry about ripping down a nice 2x6 or whatever larger board for that particular girt, because there's no need. But what I did here was a little bit different from the front side of the trailer, and I wasn't quite sure if it was going to work the way I was imagining in my head, to be honest. But since I struggled on the south side of the camper with filling that gap in between the rafters, I figured I would actually try and add a little bit more meat to it, and so I tried to cut the rafters in, and it actually worked out better than I thought. I was rather surprised. The only issue I ran into is that it left a gap in the middle at the very peak, which I'm actually okay with. That's not a bad thing. So now I just have to mark another board, and I took it up and double checked to make sure it fit on the other side, which, since everything was, I was measuring the rafters and whatnot all as carefully as I could to try and make sure everything was as square and perfect. The end result is that measuring for the one side ended up that I could swap it out, and it fit both sides, so that made a good pattern to cut the other side and throw a few more screws into that girt, and then I can throw these bird blocks up. So now when I put the siding up, I don't have to worry about trying to support that siding like I did on the other side. So that was well worth the time to make those couple of cuts and use a 2x6 for this particular girt instead of the 2x4 or 2x3. So now I'll get some siding going because I need to just get this out of the way. And this is probably the most satisfying part of the whole process for me. Once you actually get to start working on putting up that siding, and that's when it starts to feel like, in this case, like it starts to feel like it's actually going to be a home. At the moment I'm just working on cutting the notch out to go around the beam that sticks out, and that beam might disappear. I'm not sure. It was left there. It intentionally hangs about 2 feet out from the wall. The thought was that we could hang a sconce or something from the end of it, and we might still do that. I don't know. We've got a couple of ideas kicking around for sort of a little bit of a cabiny, rustic kind of a look. But who knows? We'll see how that ends up running when we get to that point. So now I'm taking a break from the siding for a minute and starting to work on the door jamb, and I wanted this piece to fit as tightly as I could. And so you can see it stayed up there. I got it down just wide enough that it actually stays up there with just friction fit. But I still threw some screws in, obviously, because that would be a bad form to not. And I did the same thing with these, with the sides of these door jambs. I want them as close, tight fitting as I could. And I'm using a 2x6 for this purpose. So that it'll help to fill the gap between where the siding will be and where the inside wall boards will be. And like I said, unfortunately we did lose, or the camera did die here pretty quick actually. So I didn't get the footage of actually building the door out, but I had Emily come and help me so that we could hold everything tight. I ended up doing some half-lap joints to attach the rails and stiles of the door. Are they still rails and stiles if it's a door? I don't know. And then I put some thinner siding pieces on the door, so 4-inch wide siding. And we were able to get that hung. I ended up having to come back in later, and I decided I hung it originally with 3 hinges, and I actually ended up adding a 4th near the top, just for extra strength, to make sure that there weren't any issues with it. So you can see there's one of the hinges sitting there on the board, and I'm just marking out where they need to go. So unfortunately, the next video will start with the door in place and doing a little bit of adjustment to it. But that's okay. Thank you for your time today, and God bless you and yours. Stay safe out there.